According to Nazi ideology, the German family should have as many children as possible. Their objective was to populate the world with pure Aryans, men and women of blonde hair, blue eyes, and ideal physical characteristics. Most families complied, including the leaders of the Nazi Party and the SS. What happened to these children after Germany lost the war? How did their family reputation affect them during adulthood? Some sons and daughters of Nazi officers were ashamed of their parents. They either changed their names and identities or became advocates of the anti-Nazi cause. Others, on the contrary, were proud of their heritage. They became leaders of neo-Nazi groups and parties. Still, some others suffered the consequences for their fathers' actions. All of them, without exception, had to live their whole lives carrying the stigma of being the children of some of the worst criminals in the history of the world. The Hitler Youth generation, being a kid in the Third Reich. When the Red Army reached Berlin in April of 1945, they were prepared their last fight to be guerrilla-style and street by street. Being the very capital city of the mighty Third Reich, they expected to meet stern resistance, maybe to find some elite divisions of SS combatants. What they found instead was a deserted city in ruins. The Soviets were horrified by the people they had to fight to gain control of Berlin. The only combats they had were against poorly equipped units of women and children. These children belonged to the Hitler Youth, a youth organization created by the Nazi Party as early as 1922 to teach young people useful skills and the National Socialist ideology. The children born between 1922 and 1930 became known as the Hitler Youth generation, as most of them, especially since the Nazis came to power in 1933, spent a good part of their childhood attending camps and activities organized by the organization. In school and youth movements, they were socialized in the ideology of National Socialism. As children and youths, these were, according to Nazi propaganda, the guarantors of the future, and they were raised to establish a new society. Their self-confidence was developed and strengthened by their affiliation to a youth movement that everyone seemed to like. For the Nazi ideology, it was imperative that German Aryan families had as many children as possible to expand the Aryan race. Marrying and having children was encouraged, and big families enjoyed a series of benefits, including state money and tax reductions. The SS created a secret association called the Lebensborn, or Fountain of Life. The Lebensborn program would help unmarried mothers who met the standards to be considered racially pure, either by giving them state support or by giving their children in adoption to other racially pure and healthy parents. The German government would also kidnap children from Polish, Yugoslavian, Norwegian and Russian families and give them to German parents so they could be Germanized, as they called it. After being kidnapped, they underwent a series of tests, and a jury of physicians decided whether they were apt for Germanization. Children who did not meet the strict standards of these doctors would be sent to concentration camps, to work or to be killed. It is estimated that the Hitler Youth generation consisted of over 9 million children, and most of the Nazi Party leaders' children were born in this generation. This means that when World War II was over, they were barely teenagers with their whole lives ahead of them. Only, they would never get rid of their past, for good or for bad. Their names will forever live in infamy. The children whose fathers were high officers of the Third Reich only knew one aspect of their fathers' personalities. The other would be reported to them after Germany's surrender. They were too young during the war to understand or even perceive what was happening. Born between 1922 and 1944, the oldest were not even 18 years old during the height of the war. Their childhood memories are often limited to the green pastures of Bavaria. Many lived in the secure perimeter around the Berghof, the Führer's mountain chalet at Obersalzberg in the Bavarian Alps, south of Munich near the Austrian border. This isolated spot, reserved for the Führer's use, was untouched by the war and its violence. They had normal or even nice childhoods, and they enjoyed many privileges that not every child had at the time. Nazi hierarchs did not share details of their work with their children, and many times even with their spouses. Rudolf Höss, the commandant of Auschwitz, had a nice house just outside the perimeter walls of the death camp, where he played with their children and tended to his garden. As most of the Nazi leaders, he was reportedly a great father who was involved in his children's upbringing, shared quality time with them, and kissed them goodnight. What the Huss kids did not know was that his father had probably signed death sentences for other children that same day, or personally oversaw the gassing of hundreds of Jews before coming home for dinner. The few Nazi children who were ashamed of their family past. Perhaps not surprisingly, most of the sons and daughters of Nazi leaders justified their father's actions. After all, these were protected children who enjoyed privilege and were well treated by everyone in Nazi Germany. They had the best toys, the best lives, and their childhoods were happy and loving. Some of them even denied the allegations against their parents, even when there was a mountain of evidence and many of their crimes were proved beyond reasonable doubt. They just could not believe that their fathers, the ones who read them bedside stories at night and took them horseback riding and camping, were responsible for the deaths of millions of people. It took a lot of courage in that context for these children to express themselves against Nazism. Nicholas Frank falls into this category. It is intolerable to him that his father never expressed remorse or regret, and that he tried to justify his actions. Frank was born in Munich on the 9th of March 1939 to Hans Frank and Brigitte Herbst. He was the youngest of the couple's 5 children. When Nicholas was about 8 months old, his father was appointed Hitler's Governor-General of the General Government in German-occupied Poland. In this position, Hans Frank became responsible for the Nazi policy of enslaving Polish citizens and exterminating the Polish Jews. Nicholas grew up in Krakow, Poland. His father was hanged following the Nuremberg trials in 1946, and after that, he started to learn little by little what he had done. Over the course of the years, his initial embarrassment about his father developed into a burning, obsessive hatred as he uncovered minute details of his father's life during a 40-year search. He became a well-respected journalist in Germany and even did various documentaries about the horrors of Nazism. Nicholas Frank published a book in 1987 titled The Father, A Settling of Accounts, in which he denounced his own father as a psychopath. He never felt any guilt for what he had done to millions of Polish people. In the book, Nicholas claims that he believes his father deserved to be executed and was delighted to be. He also questioned his father's late conversion to Catholicism, believing he only did so for absolution. However, he recognizes he shares some of his father's traits. He considers himself to be a brilliant liar and an excellent speaker with an aggressive sense of humor, which he was told it was very similar to his father's. The book was virulently criticized, especially by some other Nazi children, Klaus von Schirach and Martin Adolf Bormann in particular. The latter was a professor of theology at the time and expressed regret he and Nicholas had never spoken about their fathers. For some of these children, rejecting or cursing their fathers was out of the question. For others, the book was too violent, in both its scenes and its language. His own brothers and sisters never forgave him for writing the book and stopped talking to him altogether. So did some of his childhood friends. Nicholas regretted he never asked his mother to answer for what she did during the war. He describes his mother as cynical as she was cowardly. She was apparently very passionate about fur coats and liked to be driven around in a Mercedes-Benz car accompanied by an SS guard. Nicholas Frank explains that many times her mother would be taken by her SS chauffeur to the local market, where she could buy cheap corsets made by Jews. At that time, the Polish Jews were starving, but had to sell their goods very cheap on the market to stay alive. Frank's mother took advantage of this situation, which was mostly provoked by her husband. Some other descendants of certain key figures of the Third Reich would not be able to decide whether their parents were right or wrong, or to make declarations about them. For example, all 6 children of Joseph Goebbels, the Reich Minister of Propaganda, were killed by their parents in the Führer bunker. Goebbels' wife Magda had a son from her first marriage to Günter Quandt, who in turn had a daughter who converted to Judaism at the age of 24. Quandt, a businessman and a German Jew, was sent to the concentration camps. Ricardo Eichmann, from the archaeological dig to the International Court. Adolf Eichmann, one of the major organizers of the Holocaust, was born in Solingen in 1906. He was already a senior SS official when World War II started, and he took his job very seriously. His main task during the last years of World War II was to oversee the whole logistics of death camp deportations and to plan the genocide of all European Jews, according to the directives decided in the Wannsee Conference in 1942. As such, although he rarely visited the camps, he carefully planned the deaths of millions from the comfort of an office desk. When Germany invaded Hungary on the 19th of March 1944, Eichmann moved to the country immediately, so he could oversee the final solution in that country. On Christmas 1944, Eichmann fled Budapest just before the Soviets completed their encirclement of the capital of Hungary. He returned to Berlin, where he arranged for incriminating records of his actions regarding the Holocaust to be burned. Along with many other SS officers who fled in the closing months of the war, Eichmann and his family were living in relative safety in Austria when the war in Europe ended on the 8th of May 1945. However, at the end of the war, Eichmann was captured by US forces and spent time in several camps for SS officers using forged papers that identified him as Otto Eichmann. He escaped from a work detail at Cham, Germany, when he realized that his identity had been discovered. Moreover, by that time, Rudolf Höss was testifying in the Nuremberg trials and incriminating Eichmann as the architect of the Holocaust. Eichmann knew he had to go farther. In 1948, Eichmann obtained a landing permit for Argentina and false identification under the name Ricardo Clement through the organization directed by Bishop Alois Hudal. He then followed the monastery route into Italy and from there to Argentina, where he lived comfortably in a suburb of Buenos Aires called Olivos. Under his new identity, he made a career in the Mercedes-Benz production plant, where he eventually became head of department. His wife and his 3 sons, Klaus, Nicholas, and Horst Adolf, came to live with him shortly after he arrived in Argentina. In Argentina, Eichmann started a new life. He never spoke about the Holocaust and tried to lay low as he knew the Mossad would look for him around the world. He had another son in 1955, which he named Ricardo, a local name. When Ricardo was only 5 years old, a Mossad commando kidnapped him and took him to Jerusalem to be tried for crimes against humanity in what was known as Operation Garibaldi. Nobody bothered to explain young Ricardo why his father was taken from him. He later learned that he was executed and his ashes thrown into the Mediterranean Sea. He also learned much later from history books that his father had been one of the worst criminals in history. It was difficult for Ricardo to come to grips with the idea of his father having had another life in Germany, where he was a murderer of Jews, Poles, and Hungarians. But the more he learned, the more he despised his father and what he had done. Ricardo went on to study prehistory, classical archaeology, and Egyptology at Heidelberg University in the 1970s. He specialized in Egyptology and participated of several archaeological digs in that country, very close to where his father had been killed. He has given few interviews over the years, but on the few times he has spoken, he rejected the Nazi ideology of his father. Today, he is a very respected scholar in his field, and even has become the director of the Orient Department of the German Archaeological Institute in Berlin for 25 years, between 1996 and 2020. In 1995, Eichmann agreed to have an interview with Zvi Aharoni, the Mossad agent who tracked his father down and eventually captured him. There are no reports about the conversation they had, but later Ricardo has claimed that it was an illuminating experience. Rolf Mengele, the abandoned angel of death's son. Another example of a Nazi leader who fled to South America and tried to start a new life was Josef Mengele, the angel of death. Mengele, the chief physician at Auschwitz, was interested in what he called racial hygiene, that is, finding out the physiologic reasons that made the Aryan race so superior to the rest of races. His disgusting experiments with twins are sadly known today, despite his efforts to destroy any evidence. He treated the children as rats. Surgery was performed without anesthesia. Healthy limbs were amputated, diseases injected, wounds infected on purpose to test the resistance of human beings. The objective was to study how the inferior human bodies reacted to pain, illness, and stress. When news came that Hitler had ceased to exist, Mengele joined a German army unit who was making their way into Bavaria, now in the American zone. Unarmed and confused, he and his unit were captured and taken to Schauenstein prisoner of war camp 75 miles of 120 kilometers north of Nuremberg, where he was reunited with a friend of his, Dr. Kahler. His captors had absolutely no idea about what a big fish they had captured, especially as he told them his name was Josef Memling. Besides this, almost every SS member had their blood group tattooed on their arms, But Mengele had refused to be tattooed. Thus, they just let him and Dr. Kahler go, thinking they were just regular physicians. He then traveled to Auschwitz to retrieve his field notes, which he considered important, and then he managed to cross the southern border into Italy, landing in Genoa in 1949. There, he obtained a passport by the Red Cross with the name Helmut Gregor. In July 1949, he voyaged to Argentina, where he established himself in the town of Vicente Lopez. There, he worked as a carpenter and later as a salesman for farm equipment, thinking he was finally safe from repercussions, especially since all the Nazis who were condemned in the Nuremberg trials were already free. In Argentina, he lived under his own name. In 1958, he was questioned, together with other doctors from the same area, on suspicion of practicing medicine without a license when a teenage girl died after an abortion. However, no charges were presented. Aware that the publicity could lead to his Nazi background and wartime activities being discovered, he took an extended business trip to Paraguay and was granted citizenship there in 1959 under the name José Mengele. Before moving to Brazil, however, he obtained a passport issued by the Argentinian authorities, which he used to travel to Europe as a tourist. However, he had a very important objective for this trip. He would meet his son Rolf in Switzerland. They went together on a ski trip, but Rolf never knew that the man he met was a war criminal. In fact, he did not even know that man was his real father. He was introduced to Rolf as Uncle Fritz, and while he enjoyed the time together, he did not suspect that he had been vacationing with his biological father. Rolf would not see his father until 21 years later, in 1977. Josef's lawyer, Hans Zedelmeier, first contacted Rolf in Germany and then arranged a meeting between Rolf and his cousin Karl-Heinz, who had lived several years with Josef in Argentina. Hans Zedelmeier wanted to make sure that Rolf understood that people of his father's generation who had lived during the war could have vastly different analyses of the Third Reich than those of the newer generation of Germans who only read about the period in history books. He also needed to send money to his client via Rolf. The Zedelmeiers have always been staunch supporters of Josef Mengele. Following his father's advice, Rolf would be traveling to Brazil using the passport of a friend, which he had managed to purloin while the two were on vacation together. Nothing could stop him from seeing his father again, even though the old man was no longer his childhood hero. In fact, Rolf had communist ideas and he had nothing in common with Josef Mengele in terms of politics. Still, he had taken numerous risks to meet the man who never bothered much to know him. When Rolf was a child, his father was too busy with his deadly work for the Nazis. By the time Rolf was an adolescent, his father was on the run from the Allies and Nazi hunters both. It would be the last time Rolf saw his father alive. Nobody knows how and when he died, but it is believed that Mengele was buried in an unmarked grave somewhere in the south of Brazil. Gudrun Himmler, an angel-faced neo-Nazi princess. Heinrich Himmler was once one of the most powerful men in Germany. He was feared by many, not only the people who were sent to death camps under his supervision, but also the SS men who knew him to be a disciplined fanatic. Despite this, he was a devout father and family man. With his first wife, Margaret, he had only one child, a beautiful blonde girl named Gudrun. He later had two other girls, Helga and Nanette, with his secretary and mistress, Hedwig. But to Heinrich, Gudrun was special. She was famous among his father's acquaintances because everyone thought she embodied the ideal of the pure German race, with her blonde braided hair and her delicate facial features. There are several photographs of Gudrun with her Uncle Adolf, with her father, and with other Nazi figures where she is portrayed with all the purity of childhood. She is white as snow, wears her long blonde hair in complicated German braids and smiles angelically. As the only child of one of the most prominent families in the Nazi cabinet, she enjoyed a luxurious and happy childhood until the end of the war. Gudrun and her mother would try to sneak past the southern border into South Tyrol when Allied troops invaded the area. But on the 13th of May 1945, Margaret and her daughter were discovered in the Tyrol and taken into custody by the Allies. They spent 2 nights at an American-run hotel near Bolzano, 1 night in Verona, flew to Florence, and ended their journey in a British-run camp and interrogation center near Rome, where they were the only female prisoners. From Rome, she and Gudrun were transported to Nuremberg. On arrival, Margaret was strip-searched, and a vial of potassium cyanide was found stitched into the shoulder padding of her coat. Margaret and Gudrun were placed in a bare cell with 2 planks for beds. Recognizing that Nuremberg jail wasn't exactly an ideal environment for a teenage girl, Colonel Andrus from the US Army attempted to make Gudrun's time there as normal as possible. Nevertheless, Gudrun was interrogated on 22 September 1945. She was asked about her final meeting with her father and whether she traveled round a lot during the war years. The disciplined and angel-like Gudrun replied that she'd spent the last 5 years either at home or at school. She talked briefly about her tour of the Dachau herb plantation, and when she was questioned about whether her parents had ever discussed their post-war plans or anything else of significance, Gudrun's response was that they never told her anything at all. The interrogators believed her. After the war, Gudrun married far-right propagandist and author Wolf-Dieter Berwitz, who later became a party official in the Bavarian section of the far-right National Democratic Party, or NPD. Now turned into a bona fide Nazi princess, Gudrun became an advocate for far-right causes. She found validation among the ranks of Silent Help, an organization that helped former SS members. She worked tirelessly on its behalf for over 40 years, and its members treated her with a degree of respect and admiration that bordered on reverence. At the same time, Gudrun helped to set up a barely legal neo-Nazi group for her own generation called the Viking Youth. In 1958, Gudrun attended a gathering of SS veterans and fellow travelers held in Austria near an ancient Celtic site deep in the Bohemian forests. Gudrun was the guest of honor at what would become an annual celebration of her father's achievements. From 1961 to 1963, she worked, under a fake name, as a secretary for West Germany's Bureau of Intelligence, or BND. At the time, the agency was headed by Reinhard Gehlen, an American recruited general who hired, among others, ex-Nazis to work for BND based on their connections and experience with Eastern Europe and anti-communist activities. Gudrun died in 2018, clinging to the belief that Heinrich Himmler had done nothing wrong and was actually a national hero. Albert Speer Jr., following the family business. Adolf Hitler was a man of big dreams. One of them was to build cities for the future, with an architecture based on the National Socialist principles. To make his visions come true, he hired an architect, Albert Speer, whose amazing skills made him worthy of being in the Führer's inner circle. As the official architect of the Third Reich, he designed the beautiful Zeppelinfeld Stadium for 340,000 people, the Olympic Stadium for the 1936 Olympic Games, and the German Pavilion for the 1937 International Exposition of Paris. He also designed a monstrous stadium that would hold almost 500,000 people in Nuremberg, but this plan never came to fruition. He also built prisoner of war camps throughout the Third Reich. But he was not happy with just designing buildings, and Hitler named Speer Minister of Armaments and Munitions in 1942, after the former minister died in a plane crash. It was during this time that he committed all the war crimes that would have him imprisoned in Nuremberg in 1946. He was directly involved in the construction and alteration of concentration camps, including the expansion of Auschwitz to increase its holding capacity to 132,000 prisoners. For this task, he ordered the use of slave labor. After he was released from prison, he proclaimed that he had been unlawfully jailed, as he had taken no part in the Holocaust. He tried to pass for the good Nazi, who was faithful to the ideas of progress and welfare but had no idea of the crimes that were being committed. However, this story did not fool anyone, not even his son Albert Speer Jr. As with the other children of Nazi officials, Speer Jr. had to approach the topic of his father's infamy. While Himmler would attempt to rehabilitate her father's image, and Göring tried her best to avoid speaking about it at all, Speer Jr. always tried to separate himself from his father. He did not only bear the family name of a convicted war criminal, but also his first name. He did not distance himself from his father because he hated his father. He loved him. But he is credited with being one of the few children of Nazi leaders to recognize the wrongs of their parent. Speer has complained in several interviews about his father inattentiveness and mild neglect, but also said that Hitler was a nice uncle, as far as he could remember. He said he did not hate his father and considered him a good architect, and that he was much more modern than people think today. He respected his father's skill at work, but not his ideology. This strategy has allowed him to be valued on his own. and not as the son of Albert Speer. In fact, Albert Speer Jr. has achieved somewhat of a good reputation as an architect and urban planner. His career choice was not made to please his father, but to follow a family tradition, as his grandfather had also been an architect. Speer died in 2017, but one of his last projects came to life in the Football World Cup of 2022 in Qatar. He did not just plan the construction of stadiums, but of whole cities, in what at the moment seemed like a wild dream. In fact, he had been planning this type of cities since decades before. He published a book on the subject in 1992, called The Intelligent City. There, he outlined his vision for a forward-thinking, people-centered metropolis whose sole function is to make its inhabitants happy. For Speer, a city should feel natural and spontaneous. Its human dimension should never be underestimated. The hallmarks of its creator should also be invisible. His plans are only a framework for others to work from. Their realization is up to the architects, the designers, and the builders. He is more interested in cities and their complexities than by the aesthetics of individual buildings. Speer thinks of himself above all as a designer of urban spaces. In his thinking towards urban planning, his ideas are remarkably similar to his father's, except that in order to build the ideal city, he does not require the use of forced labor by Jewish prisoners. Edda Göring. From stardom to experiencing the horrors of jail, Emmy Göring, Hermann Göring's wife, was nicknamed the First Lady of the Third Reich. Thanks to Göring's contacts and Goebbels' propaganda machine, Emmy became one of the most respected and well-known actresses in the Reich. In the 1940s, Göring and Emmy were the first couple of the Reich. But this also sealed her destiny. Emmy's high profile earned her a conviction to 1 year in jail after the war, and she had 30% of her assets seized by the Allied government. She was also banned from the stage for 5 years. Some years after her release from jail, Emmy Göring settled down in a very small flat in the city of Munich and remained there for the rest of her life. Her daughter Edda stood out as much for her beauty as for her identity. Edda was born on June 2, 1938, and like Gudrun Himmler, she embodied the ideals of Nazi beauty. It is rumored that Hermann Göring wanted to name his new baby after Mussolini's favorite daughter, Edda Ciano. Edda Göring, however, has insisted that the name came from German mythology, which both of her parents loved. She was baptized on November 4, 938, at Karinhall, Göring's hunting estate northeast of Berlin. The religious ceremony took place with great pomp and circumstance, a fact that irritated certain members of the Nazi Party, which included many anti-church radicals at the time. But as the Führer was the godfather, nobody dared complain about it. A portrait of Edda in the arms of her loving father sold by the millions throughout Germany, and she received many presents, including a valuable painting by Lucas Cranach the Elder, whose work Göring admired. The Göring's family life was organized entirely around the new child, whom they affectionately nicknamed Eddaline. She was the sunshine of her parents' lives and immediately became a sensation in the German press. Edda grew up with Karinhall as her extravagant home, surrounded by immense grounds and beyond that, thousands of acres of forest where bison, buffalo, deer, elk and wild horses roamed freely. The rooms were stuffed with all of the artwork Göring pillaged in his insatiable treasure hunting. He liked to think of himself as the Reich's greatest patron of the arts. The mansion's basement was equipped with a cinema, a gymnasium, a pool, a billiards room, and a Russian steam bath. Elsewhere on the property were medical examining rooms, a bunker, and a reception hall called the Hunting Hall, measuring over 3,000 square feet. It was lined with hunting trophies and featured a church's nave heated by an immense fireplace. For leisure activities, as if the hunting and other distractions were not enough, 2,000 feet of electric train tracks, worth the equivalent to today's $268,000, had been laid in the attic. Lion cubs were also on the property, raised solely for the delight of the family and visitors. In the interest of safety, they were replaced every year by the Berlin Zoo when the resident cubs reached 1 year of age. The Görings raised 7 cubs in all, and all were hand-fed with a baby bottle. Edda delighted in watching her father play with her favorite cub, Muki, and even Mussolini liked to have a tussle with the little lion when he came to visit. The little princess was the adored child of a proud father who spent all of his spare time with her, playing, dancing, or cuddling. He loved to show her off in elaborate staging. Edda lived her earliest years in the lap of luxury, surrounded by loving, attentive parents who considered nothing too perfect for the princess. She had a tutor and lived isolated from the rest of the world, removed from the privations of the war. But all of this changed when her father was arrested and tried in the Nuremberg trials. It is understandable then that Edda became bitter about losing all this thanks to the interference of the Allied army. As the Red Army approached, Göring himself ordered the property of Hall to be dynamited. After transferring his art collection, worth more than 200 million Reichsmarks, to Berchtesgaden by special convoy, he let a demolition team from the Luftwaffe take care of the job. In her later years, Edda worked in a hospital laboratory and was hoping to become a medical technician. She worked in a rehabilitation clinic in Wiesbaden and devoted herself to taking care of her mother, remaining with her until she died on 8 June 1973. After that, for 5 years in the 1970s, Edda was the companion of journalist Gerd Heidemann, who had bought Göring's yacht Karin II and was devoted to the memory of Edda's father. Silence and hatred, the children of Rudolf Höss. Finally, there are Nazi children who chose to remain silent, never speaking about what their fathers did either because of shame or to avoid potential backlash. Brigitte Höss knew that her father, Rudolf Höss, commandant of Auschwitz, was guilty. His crimes caused her so much distress that after the war she left Germany, settled in anonymity in the US, and made a vow never to speak of her history with anyone. It was reported that she slept with her father's photograph over her bed, unwilling to forget that her father was very kind to her and her family. Most of the Nazi parents were kind and loving towards their children, as was part of their ideology. But this did not mean they were good people, only that they were psychopaths who did not experience any remorse or empathy with the people in concentration camps. Since the age of 1, Brigitte Höss lived near the concentration camps. Before the family moved to Auschwitz, they had lived at Dachau near Munich, and before that at Sachsenhausen, 15 miles north of Berlin. She knew her father was responsible for the prisoners. He was promoted, thanks to his exemplary conduct, to the post of Commandant of Auschwitz in Poland. The whole family was happy about this promotion. Their lives improved magically, and even had several servants to help them. When Germany fell to the Allies, Höss managed to elude capture for a time. The family fled north by car, driving at night with the headlights off, following the Himmlers and accompanied by the wife and children of Theodor Eicher. The roads were under constant bombardment by the Allies, forcing them to take shelter in the woods. News of Hitler's death arrived on May 1, 1945. Like many Nazi party members and their sympathizers, Höss had planned to commit suicide with his family and had obtained the necessary fatal doses of poison in case of capture by the Russians. He saw no future for them in Germany. He had made his decision clear to his wife Hedwig, but they did not carry through because of the children. Later, Höss would regret they turned away from a death that would have spared the family many difficulties and him having to outlive the world he worked so hard to create. But for Brigitte, it was a blessing to be allowed to live a long and fulfilling life. In 1950, Brigitte left Germany for Spain. She was a beautiful blonde, and it was easy for her to find work as a fashion model for Balenciaga. She also met her future husband, an Irish-American working in Washington, D.C. It was at this same time that her father's memoirs were published, a harrowing confession that soon became famous, going in the annals of history. She lived successively in Liberia, Greece, Iran, and Vietnam, following the career of her husband, whom she married in 1961 and with whom she had a son and a daughter. Brigitte shared her family history with her future husband shortly after they met. He expressed some shock, but came to the conclusion from their talks that she was a victim, a child at the time of the events whose life shifted from privilege to poverty from one day to the next. The children of Nazi war criminals, most of them either young kids or teenagers by the time the Third Reich ceased to exist, had to grow up and carry their whole lives the weight of what their parents had done. For most of them, it was a matter of pride, while others felt profoundly ashamed. Some went on to have political careers in the far right, like the angel-faced Gudrun Himmler. Others, like Ricardo Eichmann, became very vocal in denouncing the horrors of their father's work, and others still chose to keep to themselves and live quiet, solitary lives away from the limelight. Perhaps the most interesting case is that of Edda Göring, whose childhood was a dreamed one in a mansion surrounded by servants, toys, and even pet lion cubs. Her father took a cyanide pill to avoid being hanged in Nuremberg, and she spent the last years of her life taking care of her dying mother and dating a fascist journalist. But in all cases, no matter what these Nazi children did, the crimes committed by their parents would never be forgotten.